No dogs in my car. Get out!" His words cut through the afternoon silence like a gunshot. I stood at the curb outside the VA hospital, my hand on Rex's leash, watching this punk in aviator sunglasses refuse to look me in the eye. People were turning to stare. Someone across the street had their phone out, probably already filming. The driver's gaze fixed on the scar under my ear, then dropped to my German Shepherd's bright red service vest with its impossible-to-miss patches that read, "Service dog, do not pet." "Sir, this is a service dog," I said, keeping my voice steady even though my chest was already tightening. "He's legally required to—" "I don't care what kind of dog it is." The kid cut me off, maybe 30 years old, wearing a polo shirt like he owned the world. My car, my rules, no animals. Period. Rex pressed closer to my leg, already sensing what was coming. The familiar weight in my chest, the feeling like the walls were closing in. That's exactly what he's trained for. Detecting when my brain decides to drag me back to that IED blast outside Kandahar. Flash, heat, dust, screams over the radio. Rex pulling at my sleeve, dragging me from under fire. 5 seconds, and we're behind cover. 5 seconds that cost my hearing in one ear but saved my life. A group of nurses from the hospital had stopped to watch. A few other vets in the area were shaking their heads. I could feel my face burning with embarrassment. Here I am, just finished testifying before a Senate subcommittee about cybersecurity vulnerabilities in military networks, reduced to begging some civilian for basic human decency while he treats my service dog like a scam. You know how sometimes life hits you with a curveball so wild you can't even make sense of it until weeks later? Well, that Tuesday started as one of the worst days I'd had since coming back from Afghanistan, but it ended up being one of the most satisfying. Let me tell you exactly what happened, because this story needs to be told. I was standing there in my dress blues, sweating through the fabric because the testimony had run long and I was already late for another classified briefing at the Pentagon. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Guy like me in front of senators sounds pretty impressive. But here's the thing. I may wear the uniform and brief high-ranking officials about protecting America's digital infrastructure, but underneath it all, I'm still dealing with the same invisible wounds as every other vet who's been downrange. That's where Rex comes in. Rex is my service dog, this beautiful German Shepherd who's trained to detect my anxiety attacks before they spiral out of control. The VA paired us up about 2 years ago after I had what they politely called an episode during a Pentagon briefing. PTSD doesn't care if you're briefing generals or buying groceries. When your brain decides to take you back to that moment, when Rodriguez was bleeding out while the IED smoke cleared, you're going whether you want to or not. So there I am, in full dress uniform with my ribbons clearly visible, and Rex is sitting perfectly at attention beside me in his service vest. The bright red patches are impossible to miss if you're actually looking. I'm trying to get back to my office because my government vehicle was in the shop and, honestly, I was already running late for another classified briefing. The Uber app showed my driver was 2 minutes away in a white Honda Civic. Perfect. I'm thinking this will be smooth sailing. Quick ride back to work. Maybe grab some lunch. Typical Tuesday. Rex and I wait patiently by the curb, and when the Honda pulls up, I can see through the windshield that it's a younger guy, probably mid-30s, wearing those aviator sunglasses and a polo shirt. I open the rear door like I always do, letting Rex hop in first, then I start to slide in beside him. That's when everything went sideways. Under federal law, I tried again, service dogs are allowed in all public accommodations, including ride-share vehicles. This isn't optional. The driver actually laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. Federal law? Buddy, this is Virginia, not whatever liberal state you're from. And I'm not driving around with some mutt shedding all over my seats. Find another ride. I'm standing there in my dress blues, decorated ribbons clearly visible, with a legitimate service dog, and this guy is treating me like I'm trying to scam him. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I am, coming from briefing senators about protecting America's digital infrastructure, and I can't even get a ride home because some jackass doesn't want to follow basic civil rights law. Look, I try one more time, keeping my voice level even though Rex is pressing against my leg harder as my breathing starts to change. I understand your concern about your vehicle, but service dogs are professionally trained. Rex won't damage anything, and denying us service is actually a federal crime. I'm happy to show you his credentials. Federal crime. The driver turns around completely now, and I can see he's younger than I first thought, maybe late 20s. His face is getting red, and there's something in his expression that reminds me of the worst kind of soldier, the ones who thought rules didn't apply to them. Who the hell do you think you are threatening me? You think because you put on some costume and got yourself a fake service dog, you can push people around? Costume. He called my uniform a costume. I felt Rex press against my leg harder as my breathing started to change. The familiar tightness in my chest was building, that feeling like the world was closing in, like I was back in that Humvee watching Rodriguez bleed out while the IED smoke cleared. This is exactly the kind of situation Rex is trained for, but ironically, the very reason I need him is why we can't access the transportation I legally have a right to. Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to comply with federal ADA regulations. And I'm going to ask you to get your fake-ass service dog out of my car before I call the cops and report you for fraud. He snaps back, his voice getting louder. I know what real service dogs look like, and that's just some pet you bought a vest for online. At this point, other people are starting to stare. There's a group of nurses from the VA hospital watching from the sidewalk, a few other veterans in the area, and I can feel my face burning with embarrassment. Here I am, a combat veteran, a Pentagon cybersecurity specialist, reduced to begging some civilian for basic human dignity while he questions my service dog's legitimacy. One of the watching veterans, an older guy with a Vietnam hat, starts walking over. "Is there a problem here?" he asks, his voice carrying that authority you only get from decades of military service. The driver glances at him nervously, then back at me. "No problem, just explaining to G.I. Joe here that I don't allow pets in my vehicle." "That's a service dog, son," the Vietnam vet says quietly. "You can see the vest clear as day." "Yeah, well, anybody can buy one of those vests online," the driver shoots back. "Doesn't make it legitimate." But then the driver says something that makes my blood run cold, something that tells me this isn't just ignorance, it's deliberate cruelty. "You know what your problem is?" he says, really getting worked up now, his voice loud enough that people across the street are turning to look. "You military types think the world owes you something just because you signed up. Well, guess what, hero? Your service doesn't mean squat to me. You're probably one of those fake PTSD cases anyway, gaming the system for benefits." I hear the Vietnam vet mutter, "What a fucking asshole." But that doesn't help the situation. Rex is practically glued to my side now, doing his job perfectly, while I'm being publicly humiliated by some entitled kid who probably couldn't last 5 minutes in basic training. The driver reaches over and slams the passenger door shut, clearly ending the conversation. "Have a nice day, soldier boy. Maybe next time leave the prop dog at home and take the bus with the rest of the losers." He starts to drive away, but then stops and rolls down his window. "Oh, and thanks for your service," he adds with the most sarcastic tone I've ever heard, complete with a mock salute. Then he peels out, leaving me standing there in my dress uniform, service dog at my side, feeling smaller than I had since the day I came home from deployment. The worst part? He was right about one thing. The world kept spinning. Traffic kept moving, people went about their business, and I was just another guy with a problem that nobody else wanted to deal with. The Vietnam vet came over and apologized for the driver's behavior, offered to help me file a complaint, but what was I supposed to do? Stand on the street corner all day arguing with customer service? I ended up walking 6 blocks to catch a cab, arriving 45 minutes late to my briefing, with Rex panting from the heat and my uniform soaked with sweat. The whole way there, I kept thinking about all the times I'd briefed senior officials about threats to national security, and here I couldn't even secure basic transportation because some civilian decided my service dog was fake. But here's where it gets interesting. And I mean really interesting. That evening, I'm back at my desk in the Pentagon, trying to shake off the incident and focus on work. I'm running through some routine security clearance renewals for personnel in my department. It's boring work, but necessary. Checking backgrounds, verifying employment history, making sure people with access to classified systems haven't done anything that might compromise their trustworthiness. I'm scrolling through a file when a name catches my eye. Marcus Webb. Application for renewal of secret-level clearance for work with a defense contractor. The photo looks familiar, but I can't place it until I see his previous employment history. Turns out this Marcus Webb used to be Army, discharged in 2019 under what the file diplomatically calls administrative circumstances. I dig deeper, because that's my job, and find the real story buried in his personnel records. Specialist Marcus Webb, discharged for violating equal opportunity policies after multiple incidents of discriminatory behavior toward fellow soldiers. 3 separate complaints for racial harassment, 2 for gender discrimination, and 1 for refusing to follow direct orders regarding accommodation for a soldier with a service-connected disability. The final straw was apparently when he told a female sergeant that women don't belong in combat roles during a unit formation, right in front of the company commander. But it was the disability incident that really caught my attention. He'd refused to help a soldier with a prosthetic leg during a training exercise, claiming it wasn't his job to babysit the broken ones. But the name still feels familiar beyond just the file, so I keep reading. Current employment, independent contractor, Uber driver, seeking clearance renewal for part-time work with Booz Allen Hamilton on unclassified logistics contracts. Address: Arlington, Virginia. That's when it clicks. I pull up the Uber app on my phone and check my ride history. There it is. Tuesday afternoon, white Honda Civic, driver Marcus W. The same Marcus Webb whose security clearance renewal just landed on my desk. The same guy who called my uniform a costume and my service dog a prop. Now, I want to be crystal clear about something. I'm not the kind of person who abuses his position for personal revenge. I've been in government service long enough to know that personal grievances and professional responsibilities have to stay separate. But what happened next wasn't about revenge. It was about doing my job exactly as I'm trained to do it. See, when you're evaluating someone for security clearance, you're looking at their character, their judgment, their willingness to follow rules and respect the law. You're asking yourself, can we trust this person with information that could harm our national security if mishandled? and Marcus Webb had just demonstrated in vivid detail his complete disregard for federal regulations, his disrespect for military service, and his willingness to discriminate against disabled Americans. All of that while knowing he was interacting with someone in uniform, someone who might very well be connected to the same government. He was asking to trust him with classified information. The level of poor judgment was staggering. I did what any responsible security professional would do. I documented the incident in detail and forwarded it up the chain with a recommendation that Webb's clearance renewal be denied. I included the Uber ride receipt, the driver's name and vehicle information, and a comprehensive report on his violation of ADA regulations and his demonstrated hostility toward military personnel and disabled individuals. But I also did something else. I called a friend of mine at the Pentagon's Equal Opportunity Office and suggested they might want to look into whether Uber drivers who discriminate against disabled veterans constitute a pattern worthy of investigation. Then I called another friend at the Department of Transportation, who handles oversight of rideshare companies, and mentioned that one of their drivers had openly bragged about violating federal disability law. Within 48 hours, my phone started ringing. First call was from Uber's legal department. Apparently, someone had filed a formal ADA complaint against both the company and Marcus Webb individually, and they wanted to discuss the incident. I calmly explained what happened, provided them with Rex's service dog documentation, and mentioned that I had multiple witnesses who could verify the driver's behavior and exact words. The legal representative was professional but clearly concerned. "Mr. Johnson, we take these allegations very seriously. Can you walk me through exactly what the driver said and did?" I gave them the blow-by-blow account, including his sarcastic "thanks for your service" comment and his accusation that I was gaming the system for fake PTSD benefits. There was a long pause on the other end. "Sir, I need to ask, are you active military?" "I'm a lieutenant colonel in the Army, currently assigned to the Pentagon." Another pause. "Sir, we'll be conducting a full investigation immediately. This behavior is completely unacceptable and violates both our company policies and federal law." Second call was from my supervisor, asking why the Defense Security Service was suddenly interested in a low-level contractor's clearance renewal. I explained the connection and walked him through my assessment. He listened, asked a few clarifying questions about the severity of the incident, then told me to write it up formally for the file. "Johnson, this is exactly the kind of character assessment we need to be making," he said. "Someone who openly discriminates against disabled veterans has no business handling classified information, period." Third call was the interesting one. It was from Marcus Webb himself. "Is this, Colonel Johnson?" His voice was shaky, nothing like the cocky attitude he'd displayed outside the VA hospital. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Johnson," I corrected him. "How can I help you, Mr. Webb?" Look, I think there might be some kind of misunderstanding. I got a call from Uber saying my account is under review for ADA violations, and then my contracting company said my clearance renewal might be delayed, and I think maybe we met the other day." I let the silence hang for a moment, giving him time to really think about what he'd done. "We did meet, Mr. Webb. You were driving for Uber when you refused to transport my service dog and me from the VA hospital. You called my uniform a costume and told me my service didn't mean anything to you." The pause on his end was long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Colonel, Jesus, I had no idea you were... I didn't know you worked at..." "Mr. Webb," I interrupted. What you didn't know was that you were violating federal law and discriminating against a disabled veteran. What you also didn't know was that the person you were discriminating against happens to be responsible for evaluating security clearances for people who want to work with classified military systems. Another long pause. Then, in an even smaller voice, You worked in my unit, didn't you? In Kandahar, 3rd Cyber Operations Squadron. And suddenly I remembered. Not the face. He'd been younger then, skinnier, usually hidden under a helmet and behind a computer screen. But the attitude, the complaints from female soldiers about his comments, the incident with Sergeant Martinez when she came back from the field hospital with her prosthetic leg, and he'd made some crack about half soldiers not being fit for duty. "I remember you now," I said quietly. "You're the one who told Sergeant Martinez she didn't belong in a combat zone because of her prosthetic, right before she dragged your sorry ass to safety during that mortar attack on the compound." The breathing on his end got heavier. I could practically hear him sweating through the phone. "Look, Colonel, I think maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I was having a bad day, and maybe I came across harsher than I meant to. If there's anything I can do to make this right." "Mr. Webb, this isn't about making it right with me personally. This is about your demonstrated pattern of discriminatory behavior and disregard for federal law. I've reviewed your military record, and this incident appears to be perfectly consistent with the behavior that led to your discharge from the Army." I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end. "I reviewed your clearance application very carefully," I continued. "The position requires someone with sound judgment, respect for legal and regulatory requirements, and the ability to work effectively with diverse populations, including disabled individuals. Based on our interaction and your service record, I cannot recommend you for a security clearance at this time." "You can't do this!" His voice cracked, and suddenly he sounded like the same angry kid who'd called my service dog a prop. "This is harassment. This is abuse of power." "Mr. Webb, denying security clearance to someone who openly violates federal disability law isn't harassment. It's my job. The government has a responsibility to ensure that only trustworthy individuals have access to sensitive information. Your actions demonstrate a concerning lack of judgment and respect for the law." "But I need this job. I've got bills to pay, and this contracting gig was supposed to be my way back into decent work." "Then perhaps you should have thought about that before you decided to discriminate against a disabled veteran in broad daylight," I replied. "Actions have consequences, Mr. Webb. You're about to learn that lesson the hard way." But the story doesn't end there. In fact, it was just getting started. About a week later, I get a call from the Uber legal team again. They want to let me know that they've completed their investigation and terminated Marcus Webb's account permanently. Apparently, once they started digging, they found multiple complaints about his treatment of passengers with disabilities, elderly riders, and anyone he perceived as different. The ADA violation with Rex and me was just the latest in a pattern they couldn't ignore. "Sir, we also discovered that Mr. Webb had been falsifying his trip logs to avoid picking up passengers from certain neighborhoods," the legal representative told me. "This goes far beyond just your incident. We're implementing new training protocols for all drivers in the D.C. area as a result of this investigation." Then I got a call from Booz Allen Hamilton. Webb's potential employer wanted to understand why his clearance renewal had been denied and whether it might affect other contractors they were considering. I explained the situation professionally, focusing on the security implications of his demonstrated disregard for federal law and his pattern of discriminatory behavior. "Colonel, we appreciate you bringing this to our attention," the HR director said. We can't afford to have people with poor judgment working on any of our contracts, even unclassified ones. Character matters in this business. They thanked me and mentioned that they would be reconsidering not just Webb's application, but their entire screening process for contractors with prior military service. They wanted to make sure they weren't inadvertently hiring people who'd been discharged for misconduct. But the call that really made my day came from the VA hospital. Colonel Johnson, this is Janet Martinez. I'm the patient advocate at the VA. I wanted to let you know that your complaint about the Uber incident has led to some major positive changes. What kind of changes? I asked. Well, we've been having ongoing issues with rideshare drivers refusing service to our patients with service dogs, wheelchairs, or other disability accommodations. Your documentation was so thorough, and the fact that you're active military gave it additional weight. So we were able to work with both Uber and Lyft to implement new training requirements for drivers in this area. She went on to explain that both companies had agreed to mandatory ADA training for all drivers operating near VA facilities, with immediate account suspension for verified violations. They'd also created a new reporting system for veterans who experienced discrimination, with dedicated staff to follow up on complaints within 24 hours. Your incident basically became our test case for holding these companies accountable, she said. We've already had 6 other veterans report that drivers are being much more respectful since the new policies went into effect. But it got even better. 2 weeks after that, I received a call from Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton's office. Apparently, word of the incident had reached her staff, and she was interested in using it as part of her ongoing work on veterans' rights legislation. Colonel, we're drafting a bill that would create specific penalties for businesses that discriminate against veterans with service animals, her legislative director explained. Would you be willing to testify about your experience? A month later, I found myself back on Capitol Hill, but this time in a very different capacity. Instead of briefing senators about cybersecurity, I was testifying before the House Veterans Affairs Committee about discrimination against disabled veterans. Rex came with me, of course, and he was a perfect gentleman throughout the entire hearing. The testimony was powerful, especially when I explained how someone with Webb's history of discrimination had been seeking access to classified information. Committee members from both parties seemed genuinely shocked that the connection between character and security clearance wasn't being made more consistently. Colonel Johnson, Representative Mark Takano asked during the Q&A, in your professional opinion, how many people with similar patterns of discriminatory behavior might currently hold security clearances? Congressman, that's exactly why we need better screening protocols, I replied. Character assessment can't just focus on financial problems or foreign contacts. How someone treats the most vulnerable members of our society tells us everything we need to know about their trustworthiness. 2 months later, I'm back at the VA for a routine appointment with Rex, and I decide to test the new system by calling an Uber. The driver who picks us up is a middle-aged woman who immediately notices Rex's service vest. "Beautiful dog," she says as we get in. "I just completed the new training about service animals. Thank you for your service, by the way, both of you." As we're driving, she mentions that all the drivers in the area had to take a mandatory course about the Americans with Disabilities Act and working with veterans. Apparently, there was some incident a few months back that really opened the company's eyes, she says. There was this driver who discriminated against a Pentagon official with a service dog, and it caused a huge stink. Good thing they're taking it seriously now. I smiled and gave Rex a pat. Yeah, I heard about that incident. Good thing something positive came out of it. But the real satisfaction came a few weeks after that, when I was reviewing clearance files and saw a new application cross my desk. Marcus Webb was applying again, this time for a much lower-level position with a different contractor. Basically, data entry work that didn't require any meaningful access to sensitive information. His new application included a detailed explanation of his previous denial, along with certificates showing he'd completed voluntary ADA compliance training, anger management counseling, and what looked like genuine community service at a veterans center. The letter attached to his application was probably the closest thing to a genuine apology I've ever seen from someone in his position. "I take full responsibility for my discriminatory behavior toward Colonel Johnson and his service dog," he wrote. "My actions were inexcusable and reflected poorly on my character and judgment. I have spent the past several months educating myself about disability rights and the sacrifices made by our veterans. I understand that trust, once broken, must be earned back through consistent action, not just words." I spent a long time thinking about that application. The easy thing would have been to deny it automatically. Once you've demonstrated that kind of judgment, why should you get a second chance? But then I thought about what military service really means, what we're supposed to be fighting for. We don't serve our country to create a world where people can't change, can't learn from their mistakes, can't become better than they were. I approved his clearance, but for the absolute minimum level necessary for his position, with a recommendation for review in 6 months rather than the usual 2 years. I also added a note that any future incidents involving discrimination or disregard for federal law would result in immediate and permanent revocation. But here's the thing that really got to me. Webb had included a copy of his volunteer schedule at the Veterans Center. Every Saturday morning for 6 months, he'd been helping disabled veterans with transportation to medical appointments. One of the reference letters was from Sergeant Martinez, the same woman he discriminated against in Afghanistan. "Marcus has shown genuine remorse for his past behavior," she wrote. "He's helped me get to 3 different VA appointments when my regular transportation fell through. He installed a ramp in his personal vehicle and refuses to accept any payment for his time. People can change, and Marcus is proving it every day." I never heard from Marcus Webb again personally, but about a year later I was having lunch with a colleague who mentioned seeing an interesting training video during his own clearance renewal process. It was part of a new ethics module about the importance of character and judgment in security clearance holders. One of the cases was about an Uber driver who lost his clearance for discriminating against a disabled veteran, he said. Really drove home the point that your behavior off the job matters just as much as what you do at work. The instructor said the case led to major policy changes and helped improve services for disabled veterans across the whole area. I didn't tell him that I knew the case personally, but I did ask if the training seemed effective. "Oh yeah," he said. "Really made people think twice about how they treat others." The instructor mentioned that complaints about discrimination have dropped significantly since they started using real-world examples like that. That's when I realized this story was bigger than just one ignorant driver getting his comeuppance. It had become part of the official training curriculum, a cautionary tale that was shaping how thousands of people with security clearances thought about their responsibilities. 6 months later, I was speaking at a conference about cybersecurity and ethics, and during the Q&A, someone asked about the intersection between personal character and professional responsibility. I told them about an incident I'd experienced, without mentioning names, where someone's treatment of disabled individuals became directly relevant to their trustworthiness for handling sensitive information. The lesson, I told the audience, is that there's no such thing as private discrimination when you're seeking public trust. How you treat the most vulnerable members of society tells us everything we need to know about how you'll handle the responsibilities we give you. After the conference, a young military officer approached me. "Sir, I wanted to thank you for that story. I've been struggling with how to handle some discriminatory behavior I've witnessed in my unit, and your example helped me understand that staying silent isn't really an option." That's when I understood the real impact of what happened that day outside the VA hospital. It wasn't just about one ignorant Uber driver losing his security clearance. It wasn't even just about improving policies for disabled veterans, though that was certainly important. It was about creating a standard, a clear message that discrimination against disabled veterans isn't just morally wrong, it's a disqualifying character flaw for anyone seeking positions of trust in our government. The Webb case is now taught at the Defense Security Service Academy as a perfect example of how character assessment works in practice. New security officers are told the story as part of their training, and I've heard it's been incorporated into the curriculum at several other federal law enforcement academies as well. But the ripple effects went even further than I could have imagined. A year after the incident, I got a call from a reporter at the Washington Post. She was working on a story about discrimination against veterans with service animals, and someone had given her my name as a source. We talked for over an hour about the broader issues, and while she didn't use my specific case in the article, the story that ran had a significant impact. Within a week of the Post article, I started getting calls from veterans across the country who had experienced similar discrimination. Some were asking for advice on how to file complaints. Others just wanted to share their stories with someone who would understand. A few were fellow Pentagon employees who mentioned that they'd started carrying copies of the ADA regulations in their wallets, just in case. The story had legs. CNN picked it up next, with a segment about how discrimination cases can have unexpected national security implications. Then Fox News ran a feature about veterans' rights, using the general outlines of our case as an example of how civilian discrimination against military personnel can compromise security clearance processes. USA Today ran the biggest story with the headline, "When Discrimination Meets National Security, How One Veteran's Fight Changed Policy." The article detailed how a single incident of rideshare discrimination had exposed gaps in both federal contractor screening and disability accommodation enforcement. Within 6 months, the Department of Veterans Affairs had partnered with major rideshare companies to create the Veterans First program, dedicated customer service lines for veterans with service animals, enhanced driver training, and automatic account suspensions for discrimination complaints. The Department of Transportation issued new guidelines requiring ADA compliance training for all commercial drivers, not just those operating near VA facilities. But the most significant change came from Congress. The Veterans Service Animal Protection Act passed both houses with overwhelming bipartisan support, creating specific federal penalties for businesses that discriminate against veterans with service animals. The bill signing ceremony was at the White House, and Rex and I were among the invited guests. Standing there in the Rose Garden, watching the president sign legislation that had grown out of that awful Tuesday afternoon, I thought about all the veterans who would benefit from these protections. Every service dog team that would be treated with respect, every disabled veteran who wouldn't have to face the humiliation I'd experienced. The president mentioned our case specifically during his remarks, though he was diplomatic enough not to name names. Sometimes it takes one person's refusal to accept injustice to create change that benefits everyone, he said. That's the American spirit at its finest. 3 years later, Discrimination complaints against rideshare companies have dropped by 78% nationwide. Service dog training programs have waiting lists because of increased federal funding. The Defense Security Service has implemented the Web Protocol, mandatory character assessment based on treatment of protected classes for all contractor clearances. And Marcus Webb? Last I heard, he was working full-time at that Veterans Center, helping coordinate transportation services for disabled vets. Sergeant Martinez told me he'd applied to law school with the goal of becoming a veterans' rights advocate. Turns out, hitting rock bottom was exactly what he needed to find his true calling. I never set out to become a symbol for veterans' rights or disability advocacy. I just wanted to get to work with my service dog like any other Tuesday. But sometimes your small act of standing up for yourself becomes something much bigger. Sometimes your worst day turns into the catalyst for changes that help thousands of other people. Rex is retired now, living the good life in my backyard and getting spoiled rotten by my kids. But every time I see a service dog being treated with respect or hear about another company implementing better disability accommodation policies, I think about that hot afternoon when everything seemed to go wrong. The Marcus Webb incident spawned not just federal legislation, but a fundamental shift in how we think about the connection between personal character and professional responsibility. It's taught in business schools now as a case study in corporate responsibility. Law schools use it to discuss the intersection of civil rights and national security. But maybe the most meaningful recognition came last month when I got a letter from a veteran in Texas. His daughter has cerebral palsy and uses a service dog for mobility assistance. He'd been refused service by 3 different rideshare drivers until he mentioned he'd heard about policy changes stemming from a Pentagon case. The 4th driver not only accommodated them but apologized for his colleague's behavior and helped load her wheelchair, he wrote. I don't know who that Pentagon guy was, but tell him my family says thanks. Because of what he did, my little girl doesn't have to face the same discrimination he faced. That letter is framed on my office wall now, right next to my military decorations. Some people fight with weapons, some with words, some with legislation. I fought with paperwork and security clearance forms, and somehow it made a difference. Sometimes justice takes time. Sometimes it comes in unexpected ways. But when it finally arrives, it arrives complete, not just for you, but for everyone who comes after you. And you know what? That's exactly the kind of America worth fighting for.